My talk is going to focus on the research that myself and some colleagues at the Center for International Forestry Research have been doing, basically framed around the issue of international trade and investment and its impacts on the forest frontier and on forest-based livelihoods. So we're coming at it from an angle of forests, both sectoral and extra-sectoral influences, but landing in a terrain that is very of general relevance. And therefore, I think some of the metrics we've tried to develop to look at this issue are of more widespread relevance than forestry per se. I wanted to focus on questions 1 and 4, one being this issue of these contrasting discourses and what our research brings to bear on where along the continuum reality lies. Of course, that varies very much depending on where you are. And then finally on the question of future research. Our work to date along the lines of this theme about global land grabs or large-scale land acquisitions has tended to focus on 2 main areas. The first is on local impacts and trade-offs. And I'll talk a little bit about how we conceptualize trade-offs. And the second on the governance of land acquisition processes, acquisition and allocation processes. And I'm going to talk very briefly about both of these. The work on local impacts has tended to focus largely on the biofuel sector, and we have an info brief, which is the holding material until we can get our peer-reviewed journal papers out there. We're a little bit slow and less agile than we should be. So anyway, this is available. It summarizes findings from 6 countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America on local social and environmental impacts. And what we're finding is a very mixed picture where in some more established industries, particularly with industries that are linked very strongly to global financial markets and have reputations to protect, some significant employment benefits, and in some cases, small-scale growers are also benefiting. But by and large, the impacts are negative, and customary land users, rights holders are by far the group that tends to lose out in almost every case. But we're also, in terms of environmental impacts, finding that both smallholder and industrial-scale plantation agriculture is leading to some direct and indirect deforestation. Significant levels in many cases. We don't have a lot of data from smallholders. It's really only one case study site where we tried to quantify. It's less than industrial scale, but nevertheless significant. But when you add that up to yield and the net effects of amount of fuel production that comes at the expense of forest, you find that smallholder systems are dropping down in terms of whether they can produce sustainably, because very low yields for the amount of forest that is opened up. So this is a very important issue. And we have one of the case studies that's going to come out in this special issue is led by Wouter Ashton, a recent graduate from Belgium, looking at the carbon payback times for these different systems around the world, whether you're talking about oil palm, jatropha, or soy. And we're finding that the payback times are far in excess of the useful growth period of different species. So the one that can come the closest is oil palm, where you have anywhere from 34 to 220 years payback time, depending on whether you're opening in peat swamp forest or somewhere else. But, and then the other feedstocks actually having a much worse situation than that. So that paper is coming out, and I think will generate quite a lot of debate, given the reported climatic benefits of biofuels. As far as the trade-off lens, what we're seeing is CIFOR has a mandate towards rural livelihoods and equity and forest conservation, but this doesn't really speak to the national imperatives that are guiding decision makers. And it's important, we think, to relate to some of the rationalization narratives that are being put forth as far as the purported benefits of foreign direct investment, which can be generated both at the local level but at the national level in terms of improving balance of trade, technological and economic spillovers to other sectors and points in the value chain, job creation. And to what extent are we really trying to look at those issues and determine whether those purported benefits are playing out in practice? And in the absence of such a metric, the rhetoric is going to stand up as truth. and will be in a very weak bargaining position. So we're starting to develop this metric, but we find ourselves constrained by disciplinary expertise. We need people who are looking at macroeconomics and these kinds of issues. And I don't know how many since we did an ecological assessment yesterday, how many economists, maybe many economists, I don't know, but looking at the macro level issues. Anyway, everybody's silent. So, moving on to the question of governance of trade-offs. Can you let me know when I have about 3 minutes left?
Yep.
Moving on to the question of governance of these trade-offs. How can we have a situation in which decisions are being made that are so far from the public interest? And we're looking at this from a number of lenses, but the paper that we developed for this conference, which will be presented on Friday in panel 28, looks at 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and looks at the legal framework supporting customary rights as well as the land allocation acquisition process. Then looks at practice, what's happening in reality from a series of case studies to try to see where there's disconnects between the legal and institutional frameworks and the practice, and then what are the outcomes from that. And the basic conclusion is that there's a wide variety of legal frameworks and there's a wide variety of practices, but the outcomes are overwhelmingly similar. And so it raises an interesting analytical challenge. How can that be the case? Are legal frameworks irrelevant? Is it a matter of enforcement? Or is it a matter of multiple pathways for achieving the same disappointing ends? And we think it's a little bit of both, or all three, however many issues I just mentioned. So this is a concern. So clearly there's some underwriting processes, power dynamics, which are at play. I wanted to mention 3...
2 or 3 minutes.
Oh yeah, okay, very quickly. I'm going to skip over some of these things. Just the role of 3 key sets of regulatory and promotional practices that I want to highlight without talking about them in any detail. Investment promotion agencies playing a very key role. They're mostly promotional, but the regulatory function is weak or non-existent. Environmental impact, we're not talking about environmental impact processes much, but they're very much fundamental to this issue because they're supposed to, in many cases, involve consultations with affected stakeholders, etc., some kind of compensation. So we need to be looking at that along with the question of land allocation and acquisition processes. But very importantly from this analysis is that the rules of the game are being rewritten on a massive scale. We're finding that irrespective of historical context, cultural context in these different countries, that you're finding very similar institutional landscape in terms of investment promotion, in terms of generating very attractive investment incentives, as well as land policy reforms. And so it does point to the transnational, but not in the sense of who's grabbing land, but of who is setting the rules of the game. So we need to be looking at that as well. I wanted to spend maybe 1 or 2 minutes, if you'll allow, on the question of future research at the expense of making CIFOR relevant in the years to come. The first is that the role of the state is not one of checks and balances or regulation of corporate actors, but tends to be strongly promotional and in some cases turning a blind eye, sometimes intentionally, but sometimes also because the resources are simply not there, such as in the case of environmental impact assessments. But what is behind that? We're seeing very clear evidence from stakeholder interviews and evidence that state actors are actually actively encouraging investors to come to their home areas. We're seeing that people have really bought into this model of development. There's a very strong ideological underpinning guiding decision making, and it's very honest in some cases and earnest in terms of wanting to do good. But what else is behind it? And this is something where we're only starting to scratch the surface. What interests, histories, rivalries, worldviews does this issue tap into that gives it so much power in terms of moving forward rather uncritically? And through what processes and by whom are policies on land, investment, and trade getting rewritten? So this is the first set of issues I wanted to raise. And this also leads to the second. Whose interest is the current trend serving? From local to global levels, we have a very good sense of who's interested serving at the local level, some idea at the national level and less idea at the global level, although it's coming up very strongly in the dialogue in this conference. And what conflicts of interest and of mandate does it represent for these different sets of actors? And we're seeing conflicts of interest between, for example, single sets of actors that are either in a position to capture rent through the legal frameworks in place or informally, who are also in a regulatory role or some kind of role, some kind of stage in the land allocation process where they should be providing checks and balances on chiefly authority, for example. And so really highlighting where those conflicts exist, conflicts of interest exist. And I have very little time, so I'm going to finish with my fourth I'm going to skip my third point. Where can governance interventions bring the highest returns? We're seeing very clearly the aims that should come through governance innovations, but we're not sure about the processes for achieving those aims. That is something subject to further testing, but just some of the issues that I wanted to raise. Processes for identifying land availability. This came up very clearly in a panel yesterday afternoon. The nature of land rights afforded to investors. In many cases, there's no cap on the area, nor is there a cap on the cap on the duration is 99 years renewable. So there's, in essence, no cap also on duration of land acquisition. And many of these transfers are permanent. In two or three of the countries that we studied, land must be transferred from customary to state land prior to investor access. And so this is a permanent transfer away from local control. Checks and balances on government mediation, particularly prior to community consultation. We're seeing that government actors are coming in, whether or not there's a legally mandated role at that point in the process, and negotiating terms which set up conditions that make the consultation process very difficult to deliver positive outcomes.
Could you be
finished? Sorry, last one. Legislating compensation and who can and cannot capture benefits. It needs to be made explicit, and it's not. And managing expectations of local land use. I'm very sorry for going over time, but thank you.